The sun over Calico Ridge wasn't a friend. It was a hammer, beating gold and heat into the dust until the whole world shimmered with it. Down in the town square, a girl sat in the back of a wagon. She was shackled. Her name was Delmore May, and she'd just turned 19. Her father, a man whose love had long ago drowned in a whiskey bottle, had sold her. For a piece of paper and a drunken grin, he'd handed her over to the sheriff. A burden, he called her. Then he'd stumbled into the saloon, and that was that. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that tears were just water, and this land was thirsty for more than that. Her wrists were raw under the iron, her lips cracked, but her eyes were fixed, staring straight ahead, like she was watching a memory burn. Men walked by. Most didn't look twice. A few did, and those looks made her feel like a bug under a glass. She held their gaze until they looked away. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then she heard it. The slow, heavy clink of spurs on the boardwalk. A man stepped into the sun. He was big, built like a barrel, with a gut that strained the buttons of his vest. His boots were too clean for a place like this. His eyes, small and dark, swept the square and landed on her. They stopped, like a hawk spotting a field mouse. He walked toward the wagon, each step a final heavy thud. The sheriff, a man who wore his badge like an apology, got up to meet him. "That her?" the man grunted, a cigar clamped in his teeth. The sheriff nodded. "Amos Weller, from out on Horseshoe Canyon." Weller ignored him. He moved right up to the wagon, close enough for her to smell the sour smoke on his breath. He didn't ask her name. He didn't care. He reached out a thick, dirty thumb and hooked it under her chin, forcing her head up. His nail dug into her skin. "She got all her teeth?" he asked the sheriff, but his eyes never left hers. "She ain't livestock, Amos," the sheriff mumbled, looking at his own boots. "Didn't ask for your sermon." Weller's gaze was a physical weight. He was looking for something. A crack, a flicker of fear, a sign that she was already broken. Delmore gave him nothing, just a flat, empty stare. "You listen well?" he asked her. Silence. "Can you work?" Still silence. She felt the pressure on her chin increase. He let out a short, guttural laugh. "Good. I don't like talkers." He turned, slapped a leather pouch of coins into the sheriff's hand, and the deal was done. The sound of the clinking metal was the sound of a door slamming shut on her life. Weller's grip was like iron as he pulled her from the wagon. Her legs, stiff from hours of sitting, nearly buckled. She caught herself, refusing to show weakness. Someone in the small crowd reached out to steady her. She shook the hand off without looking. "Feisty," Weller chuckled. No one else said a word. The good people of Calico Ridge found it was always easier to look away. His wagon was old, the wheels scarred from rock and trail, pulled by a mule that looked like it had died a week ago and just hadn't laid down yet. She sat in the back, the chains gone, but still coiled near Weller's rifle. A reminder. They rode for hours. The world dissolved into a blur of sunburned hills and skeletal cactus. There was no shade, no water, just a crushing, relentless heat that felt like it was trying to suffocate you. This wasn't just the wilderness. It was the end of the world, and she was being driven straight into its heart. The mule finally slowed. They'd arrived. It wasn't a ranch. It was a scar on the land. A leaning cabin, two collapsed sheds, and a windmill that groaned with every turn, its blades bent and broken. The air smelled of rot, dust, and a deep, profound loneliness that seemed to rise from the very soil. Delmore got down without being told. Her boots sank into the fine gray dust. Weller pointed to the cabin. "Inside." The door creaked open into a darkness that felt years old. One small bed with a stained mattress, a single table, a cold stove. That was it. He followed her in, dropping a sack of supplies on the floor with a heavy thud. He sank into the only chair, the wood groaning under his weight. And then he laid out the rules. "Sunrise, you're up," he said, his voice flat. "You feed the stock, you mend the fences, you haul the water." His eyes were like chips of stone. "You don't speak unless I tell you to. You don't go near the ridge. You don't go near that cellar door out back." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And you don't ever leave." She met his gaze, her own voice steady and clear in the suffocating silence. "What happens if I do?" He didn't answer. He just looked her over, up and down, like he was checking a piece of lumber for cracks. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. Then he stood. "You'll sleep here," he grunted, kicking a thin straw mat in the corner. "That bed's mine." He left, slamming the door. The sound echoed in the small room. Delmore stood there in the dim light. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing in on her. Her hands were raw, her back ached, but her eyes were dry. She had not cried when her mother died. She had not cried when her father sold her. She would not cry now. As darkness fell, a deep, starless black, she began to move. Silent, cautious, a ghost in her own prison. Her fingers traced the rough wood of the table, checked the space behind the rusted stove. Nothing. But then, near the back wall, behind a pile of old tools, she felt it. A floorboard gave way slightly under her foot. She dropped to her knees, her heart starting a low, steady drumbeat. She worked her fingertips into the crack, prying gently. The old wood groaned in protest, and then it lifted. Beneath it, nestled in the cool, dark earth, was a small tin box. It was crusted with rust and time. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a scrap of delicate lace, 2 old coins, and a small brass key. She picked up the key. It was worn smooth from years of being held, but it was solid, real. It wasn't a key to any door in this cabin. She knew that instantly. It was a key to a secret. Suddenly, she heard the scrape of a boot on the porch. Her blood ran cold. In a single fluid motion, she shoved the box back into its hole, replaced the board, and scrambled to her feet just as the cabin door creaked open. Weller stood there, a silhouette against the night, squinting into the dark. "Sleep," he ordered. "Work starts early." He closed the door again. Delmore didn't move for a long time. Then, she slowly sank onto the straw mat, her body rigid. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She lay there, staring into the oppressive blackness, her fingers wrapped tight around the small brass key in her pocket. Outside, the wind howled a lonely, mournful song across the canyon. But for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt something other than despair. It was a tiny, dangerous spark. Hope. Amos Weller had secrets, the kind of secrets that people bury under the floorboards, and she had just found the key to unlock them. Morning didn't break, it shattered. A rooster screamed, and Weller kicked the door open, tossing a tin plate of dry cornbread onto the floor. "Eat," he grunted. She did. Fast. The work was brutal, hauling buckets from a well that seemed a mile deep, mucking out the mule's stall, scrubbing the porch boards with a brush that tore the skin from her palms. And all day, he watched her. He sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a cigar wedged in his mouth, his eyes never leaving her. He didn't speak. He just watched, judged, waited. She worked until her muscles screamed and her hands bled. But she never stopped scanning, learning. The layout of the ranch, the way the shadows fell in the afternoon, the location of the forbidden cellar door, bolted shut with a heavy rusted lock. At dusk, exhausted, She stood at the edge of the property, her back to the cabin. She stared at the ridge, the one he'd warned her away from. And that's when she saw it. Far off, a flicker of movement. A shape against the setting sun. Too far to be sure. A man, or just a trick of the heat and light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She spun around fast, her eyes darting to the porch. Weller was still there, watching. Had he seen it? Had he seen her looking? His face was a mask of indifference. She lowered her head and went back to her chores. That night he drank. He sat by the small fire in the hearth, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. Delmore sat on her mat, silent, watching the flames dance. "You're not the first," he said suddenly, his voice thick with drink. She didn't move, didn't breathe. "Others came before you," he slurred, taking a long pull from the bottle. Couldn't handle it. Too soft. He let out a low, rumbling chuckle that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You'll learn," he said. "They all learn." She kept her eyes on the fire. Not at him. Never at him. After his snores filled the cabin, a deep, rattling sound, she crept back to the loose floorboard. She pulled out the tin box. She didn't look at the lace or the coins. Just the key. She turned it over and over in her palm. The ridge, the cellar, the girls who came before. It was all connected. A dark, twisted map. People like Amos Weller didn't just have secrets. They were made of them. She wasn't going to run. Not yet. Running was for the scared. She was something else now. Something harder. First, she would uncover everything. Every lie. Every buried bone. Then, when he was exposed, when he was vulnerable, she would disappear, and she would take his secrets with her. She carefully put the box away and stood up, moving toward the single grimy window. The wind was picking up, swirling the dust into ghostly shapes. And then she saw it again, out in the darkness, just beyond the fence line. A sudden, brilliant flare of orange. A match. It illuminated a figure for a split second. A man on a horse. A silhouette carved out of the night. He was just sitting there, watching the house, watching her. The flame died as quickly as it appeared, plunging him back into the impenetrable black. Delmore didn't move. She didn't even blink. He was gone, vanished as if he were never there. But she had seen him, and he had seen her. A slow, deliberate smile touched her lips. It felt strange, foreign. The first time she had smiled in months. Not a mirage, not a ghost. Someone was coming, and she was no longer alone. The wind outside howled, but for the first time, it didn't sound like a cry of despair. It sounded like a promise. The next day, the air itself felt different. Tense, electric. The fine dust that coated everything seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy. Delmore woke with it in her mouth, her body a single throbbing ache. Weller had no sympathy. He pointed toward the barn, then stalked back inside the cabin, the whiskey bottle already in his hand. She worked, her mind racing. She kept glancing at the ridge, but it was empty. Silent. Still, the feeling persisted. Something had shifted in the balance of this place. The gears of fate were beginning to turn. Just after noon, a cowboy rode into Calico Ridge. He didn't swagger. He didn't greet anyone. He just dismounted, tied his horse, and walked into the saloon like a ghost returning to its haunt. He was covered in the dust of a long ride. His face was all sharp angles and sun-baked leather. No one knew him, and in a town this small, a stranger was an event. The piano player stopped mid-song. The bartender paused, a dirty rag in his hand. The cowboy walked to the bar but didn't order a drink. He just laid a coin on the scarred wood. "Looking for a man," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "Amos Weller." The bartender's eyes flickered with fear. Ain't seen him in town for a spell. Lives out in Horseshoe Canyon. The cowboy nodded once, no flicker of emotion. A grizzled old timer by the window spoke up, his voice low. Best not go poking around Weller's place, friend. Ain't safe. The cowboy turned his head, just slightly. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky. I didn't ask for advice. The old timer looked down at his glass and didn't speak again. A moment later, the cowboy was gone, the saloon doors swinging in his wake. No one dared to follow him. That evening, when Delmore cleared Weller's plate, she found it. A small, folded piece of paper tucked underneath. Her fingers brushed against it. Her heart leaped into her throat. She glanced at Weller, but he was staring into the fire, lost in a drunken haze. Quickly, she slipped the note into her apron pocket. Her hands were shaking. Later, as she scrubbed the dishes in a basin of murky water, she unfolded it. The letters were thin, scratched in pencil. Do not fear the coyote. What did it mean? Who could have left it? It had to be him, the man on the ridge. The knowledge that someone was out there, close enough to leave her a message, was a brand of hope so fierce it almost hurt. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark well of her despair. That night she waited until Weller's breathing was deep and ragged. Then she crept to the cabin door and opened it a crack. The wind whispered through the opening. Come back, she whispered into the darkness. Please come back. The next day, the storm broke. Not a storm of rain and thunder, a storm of rage. Weller had found the note. She knew the second she walked into the cabin. He was standing by the table, the tiny scrap of paper held between his thumb and forefinger. His face was a thundercloud. Where did you get this? He hissed. Delmore said nothing. He crossed the room in 2 strides and slapped her hard. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side, and she tasted blood. She didn't make a sound. Someone's been on my land, he growled, his face inches from hers. Did you talk to him? She shook her head, her eyes defiant. He didn't believe her. Her punishment was the barn. He shoved her inside and bolted the door from the outside. No food, no water. The sun beat down on the wooden roof, turning the inside of the barn into an oven. The air grew thick with the smell of hay and manure. Sweat poured down her face. She slumped against a wooden support beam, her body screaming for water. But her mind was sharp. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. And then she saw them, scratched into the beam right beside her head. Names: Eliza, Sarah, Jill. The letters were carved deep, with desperate, trembling hands. Some were faded, almost gone. One looked fresh, raw. Delmore traced the name Sarah with her fingertip. They were real. The girls who came before. They had stood in this very spot. They had suffered in this suffocating heat. They had been real. And now they were gone. That night after Weller, drunk and satisfied with his cruelty, finally passed out, Delmore whispered their names into the darkness of the cabin. She didn't cry for them. Crying was useless. Instead, a cold, hard resolve settled in her heart. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. This was for Eliza, for Sarah, for Jill. Then, through the window, she saw it. Beyond the fence line, a single defiant flicker of orange. The match. Her heart surged. He was still out there. He hadn't abandoned her. He was watching, waiting. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the waiting was almost over. The man who called himself a cowboy didn't sleep in a bed. He slept under the stars, his hat pulled low, his horse standing guard nearby. He ate dried meat from a pouch and drank from a canteen. He didn't need a map. He'd ridden these cursed hills before. A lifetime ago, when his sister Sarah was still alive. She was 16 when she'd run off with a man she claimed to love. A charming man with a dark temper. Her letters had been full of hope at first, then fear. Then they had stopped coming altogether. The town forgot about Sarah Granger. Her brother, Eli, had not. And now he was back to collect a debt that could only be paid in blood. Delmore's mind was a whirlwind of planning. She moved with a new purpose. Every chore was an opportunity to observe. She learned Weller's rhythms, how many swigs from the bottle it took to make him stumble, how long he sat on the porch after his meal, where he hung his keys. She started hiding things, a crust of bread in her pocket, a small flask of water under a loose stone by the well. Her body was a prisoner here, but her mind was already over the ridge. She was no longer the scared girl who arrived in shackles. She was a weapon, being sharpened on the stone of Weller's cruelty. The third night she was jolted awake by a faint sound, a soft click. A slip of paper had been pushed under the door. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. 3 nights. Be ready. Her breath caught. 3 nights until what? Rescue or something else? A warning, a promise. It didn't matter. A deadline had been set. The next 2 days were a blur of tension. Weller was on edge. He came back from a trip to town early, his hands shaking, his eyes darting toward the windows. He hadn't seen the cowboy, but he'd heard the whispers. A stranger asking questions. He started keeping the shotgun loaded and close. He bolted the door at night. He was a cornered animal, and he was getting more dangerous. That evening, as Delmore swept the porch, she looked toward the ridge. He was there, the cowboy, closer this time, standing still as a statue, watching the house, watching her. Her heart stopped. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't move. He didn't have to. The message was clear. The 3 nights were almost up. Tomorrow was the end. The next morning, Weller woke in a full-blown rage. The mule was sick. A bucket had cracked. Small things, but enough to set him off. He took it out on Delmore. He shoved her to the ground, the dust and grit scraping her cheek. He stood over her, yelling, his spit hitting her face. She stayed down, the taste of blood and dirt in her mouth. She let him yell. She didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, cold calm. "You're already a ghost, Amos Weller," she thought. "You just don't know it yet." That night she made her preparations. The small brass key, a sharp knife she'd stolen from the kitchen, a piece of dried biscuit. She didn't sleep. She sat on her mat in the darkness, every muscle coiled, every nerve ending tingling, waiting. At midnight the wind rose, rattling the loose shutter. And so did she. She tied her hair back, tucked the knife into the waistband of her dress, and listened. A floorboard creaked on the porch. It wasn't Weller's heavy, drunken tread. It was slow, deliberate, silent. The cabin door opened with a low groan. A tall, shadowed figure filled the doorway. Hat brim pulled low, a faint scar visible on his cheek in the moonlight. It was him, the cowboy. Eli. He looked at her, and his eyes weren't looking at a victim. They were looking at a soldier. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him without a sound. He spoke only one word. "Ready?" She nodded. No fear, no hesitation. The sun was still hours away. But before it rose, judgment was coming to Horseshoe Canyon, and only one of them would walk away to see the dawn. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was thick with the smell of old wood, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of fear. Delmore stood near the cold hearth, the cowboy, Eli, at her side. They moved like shadows, 2 predators in the dark, waiting for their prey to stir. "You got a weapon?" Eli's voice was a low rumble, barely a whisper. She nodded, pulling the small, sharp kitchen knife from her dress. It wasn't much, but it was hers. He gave it a quick glance, then a single approving nod. He wasn't judging its size. He was judging her will to use it. Outside, the wind moaned, scraping dry leaves across the dirt. It sounded like it was trying to warn them. Or maybe it was mourning what was about to happen. "He drinks himself to sleep," she whispered, her voice tight. "Most nights." "Not tonight," Eli said, his eyes scanning every dark corner of the room. "How do you know?" He finally looked at her, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window, she saw the ghost of his sister in his eyes. "Because I'm here." He moved with a quiet, deadly grace, checking the single window, the latch on the door. He was a man who understood traps. He wasn't about to walk into one. Delmore's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Her whole body felt alive, buzzing with an energy she'd never known. It was the feeling of taking back control. "I need to get something," she said, her voice barely audible. "Before we go." Eli raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He trusted her. She crossed the room, her bare feet making no sound on the rough floorboards. She knelt by the back wall, found the groove with her fingertips, and lifted the loose board. The tin box was there, untouched. She opened it, her fingers moving quickly. She grabbed the lace, the coins, and the brass key. "What's that?" Eli asked from across the room. "Evidence," she said, tucking the key deep into her pocket. "Maybe." She stood up, the cold metal of the knife handle pressed against her palm. She was ready. And then the front door exploded inward. It slammed against the wall with a deafening crash, and Amos Weller filled the doorway. He held a shotgun, its double barrels looking like two dark, empty eyes. His own eyes were bloodshot, wild with a paranoid fury. "Thought I heard rats," he snarled. His gaze fell on Delmore, and then it slid past her to Eli. Everything went still. The wind died. The world held its breath. A slow, rotten grin spread across Weller's face. "Well, I'll be damned. Eli Granger, you got your sister's eyes." Delmore's blood turned to ice. Sarah Granger, the name from the barn wall. It was his sister. Eli took a half step forward, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. "I came for her, Amos." "You came to die," Weller sneered, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "Just like she did." "You murdered her." "I gave her a home," Weller roared. "Same as I gave this one. A roof, food. They should be grateful." Before she even knew she was moving, Delmore stepped forward, placing herself between them. "You don't get to say her name," she said, her voice shaking with a rage so pure it burned. Weller let out a bark of laughter. "This ain't your fight, girl." "I found them," she said, her voice growing stronger. "The name's in the barn, the key under the floor. She wasn't the first, was she?" The grin vanished from Weller's face. It was replaced by something much uglier. Contempt. "She was soft," he spat. "Just like you." "No," Delmore said, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not." The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Then Weller raised the shotgun. Eli drew his pistol. The blast was deafening. It shook the entire cabin, knocking dust from the rafters. But Eli was faster. His bullet struck first, tearing into Weller's shoulder. The impact spun him sideways, and his shotgun blast went wild, ripping a hole in the ceiling. Smoke and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Delmore dove for cover, landing hard behind the table. Weller staggered back, bellowing in pain and rage, clutching his bleeding arm. "You son of a—" He tried to swing the shotgun around for another shot, but Eli fired again. The second bullet slammed into Weller's leg. His knee buckled, and he went down with a scream, the shotgun clattering onto the floorboards. Delmore scrambled out from behind the table and kicked the weapon away, sending it sliding into the darkest corner of the room. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Eli stepped forward, his pistol still aimed at Weller's chest. "Tell me what you did to her," he commanded, his voice shaking with years of pent-up grief and hatred. Weller coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the floor. "She ran," he wheezed. "Got scared and ran off into the canyon. I let her go. You're a liar." "The coyotes did the rest," Weller gasped, a pained, triumphant smirk on his face. Delmore felt sick. "She wrote to you," she said, stepping closer, the knife still clutched in her hand. "She begged you to let her go home." Weller's eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. He chuckled, a wet, gurgling sound. "You girls are all the same, always thinking someone's coming to save you." His gaze was filled with a chilling finality. "But no one ever comes." He looked from her to Eli, then back again. "Not till now." Delmore didn't flinch. She leaned down, her face close to his. "Then maybe this is the part where you beg." Weller tried to push himself up, but his body failed him. He collapsed back onto the floor, helpless. Eli looked at Delmore. A silent question passed between them. "Do you want to finish it?" he asked. Her hand tightened on the knife. She thought of the names on the wall, of the fear in the dark, of the hope she'd felt when she saw that first match flare on the ridge. She looked down at the pathetic, bleeding man on the floor, and she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice clear and cold as stone. "But he doesn't get to live." Eli nodded once. A single final shot echoed through the canyon. And then there was only silence. The only sounds were the wind outside and the ragged rhythm of their breathing. The dust began to settle. The night began to reclaim its quiet. Eli slowly holstered his pistol, his eyes fixed on Weller's still body. "He wasn't lying," he said after a long moment, his voice hollow. "About her running. I found her bones in the canyon last year." Delmore swallowed hard. "Then why come back?" Eli finally looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "Because she didn't deserve to be forgotten," he said softly. "And neither did you." They stood there in the aftermath, two strangers bound by violence and grief. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, a pale gray line on the horizon. Dawn was coming. "You should go," Eli said, his voice practical again. "There'll be questions. A body." "Where would I go?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "East, maybe. You're free now." She shook her head. "Not yet." She walked back to the loose floorboard and retrieved the tin box. She took out the scrap of lace. Then she walked out of the cabin, leaving Eli alone with the dead. She went to the ridge, to the spot where she had first seen the light. The wind was sharp, cold. Using her bare hands, she dug a small hole in the rocky soil. She placed the lace inside. A small makeshift grave, a memorial for a girl she never knew. She whispered the name. "Sarah." Then she stood up and walked back to the cabin. Eli had Weller's horse saddled and ready. "You sure?" he asked as she approached. "No," Delmore said, "but I'm ready." She watched him mount his horse and ride away, the dust from his trail catching the first light of dawn. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But for the first time in a very long time, her hands were steady. She went back for the shovel. She dragged Amos Weller's body out to the barn and buried him in the dirt floor. No stone, no name. Nothing to mark the spot where evil had finally returned to the earth. Then she walked back to the cabin one last time, and she set it on fire. The dry old wood caught instantly. Flames licked up the walls, hungry and bright. The fire lit up the pre-dawn sky, a brilliant orange signal of defiance and rebirth. She stood and watched until the roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Only when it was nothing but a pile of glowing ash did she turn and walk away. The ridge was ahead of her, and beyond it, a new life. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side of that canyon, but she was nobody's property. She was nobody's prisoner. She was Delmore May, and she was free. The fire burned itself out by morning, leaving a black, smoking wound on the land. Delmore stood on the ridge, the faint heat warming her back as she looked out over the vast, empty expanse. The hiss and crackle of the dying embers was the only sound. It was the sound of an ending and a beginning. Ash drifted on the wind, and she breathed it in. It didn't taste like bitterness or revenge. It tasted like freedom. She turned her eyes west, toward the unknown. She had no map, no destination. For the first time in her life, the path ahead was entirely her own. She rode through towns that had no names, and across plains so wide they seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. She met drifters and gamblers, widows and thieves. She learned that the world was full of men like Amos Weller, but it was also full of people who fought back. In a dusty crossroads town, she found a blacksmith. She gave him the 2 old coins from the tin box. In return, he gave her a revolver. It was heavy in her hand, solid, a promise of protection she had never known. "You look like you know how to use one of these," the blacksmith said, his eyes kind. "I'm learning," she replied. She did. She practiced in dry riverbeds, shooting at discarded bottles until she could hit one from 50 paces. The kick of the gun against her palm was a shock, but it was a shock she controlled. Months turned into a year. The sun and the wind weathered her face. The girl who had sat shackled in the wagon was gone, burned away in the fire of her own making. In her place was a woman made of grit and steel. One night, in a rowdy saloon, a man with whiskey on his breath and arrogance in his eyes grabbed her arm. "Where you going in such a hurry, pretty thing?" he slurred. The saloon went quiet. Every eye turned to them. Delmore didn't struggle. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked him in the eye. "Let go of my arm," she said, her voice low and steady. He laughed. "Or what?" She didn't answer with words. She drew her revolver. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the room. She pressed the cold barrel against his temple. "I said," she repeated, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Let go." He let go. His face was pale, his hands shaking. No one ever tried to touch her again. Stories began to spread. Whispers of a lone woman rider with eyes that had seen too much. They said she rode out of Horseshoe Canyon, out of the ashes of a fire that had claimed a monster. They called her the Ghost of Calico Ridge. She never stayed in one place for long. The open trail was her home now. The sky was her roof. Sometimes when the night was clear and the stars were bright, she would think of Eli Granger. She wondered if he had found peace. And sometimes she would think of the names carved into the wood of that dark, terrible barn. Eliza, Sarah, Jill. She was living for them now. She was living the life they never got to have. One day she rode into a town just as the sun was setting. She saw a sheriff pinning a notice to a board. A wealthy rancher was looking for hired guns to protect his land from bandits. The old Delmore would have kept riding, but she wasn't the old Delmore. She dismounted and walked toward the sheriff. He looked her up and down, a doubtful look on his face. "This is no job for a woman," he said. Delmore just smiled. It was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised," she said, "what a woman can do." She rode out the next morning with a dozen hardened men, the only woman among them. They looked at her with suspicion, with contempt. They learned to look at her with respect. She was faster with her gun. She was smarter on the trail. And she was fearless in the face of danger. She had faced the worst kind of evil in a quiet, lonely cabin. A band of loud, clumsy bandits was nothing. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a fighter, a legend in the making. She never went back to Calico Ridge. There was nothing for her there but ghosts and ash. The future was always ahead, just over the next horizon. She rode on, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. She didn't know where she was going, and she didn't care. All that mattered was that she was riding free. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice from the darkest corners of history, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button.